Let's talk.
Giles Brown. A training school for elephants is the powerful story of Africa from the acclaimed author of, and this is one of my favourite book titles ever, The Lost Pianos of Siberia. It is the new book by Sophy Roberts. Delighted to say that Sophy joins me live on the line now. Good morning to you, Sophy.
Good morning, Giles. Thank you for having me on.
Pleasure is all mine. So we've got Lost Elephants in Africa, a training school for elephants in Africa, and Lost Pianos of Siberia. And whereabouts are you today, Sophy?
I'm in Dorset, where I live, in the hills of Dorset, where I'm heading up to London for my book launch tonight. A quiet and beautiful part of the coastal Britain.
Marvellous. Now, just explain. This is quite an amazing story, and it takes in a whole sweep of colonialism, elephants, the vestiges of the 18th or 19th century. So just tell me a little bit about the backstory to this one and how you found it.
Sure. Well, it was between lockdowns, and I went to stay at a friend's cottage in Ireland, in Donegal, a very, very beautiful wild bit of Ireland, and I was restless, like so many people through that period. And obviously, I've made my living as a writer and a travel writer, and so for the 2 years, I couldn't move, I couldn't think, I couldn't be me. And when I was in this cottage, wild, beautiful cottage with these kind of rock stacks out in the ocean beyond, this friend of mine who'd spent many years living on Lake Tanganyika in the middle of Africa, he had various books on that part of the world, and among those books there was a map, and on that map there was a picture of this little dot of these great blue lakes that run up that rift through the middle, Lake Tanganyika and more. And it prompted me to remember and to go back into a story that had always kind of nagged at me from 2015, when I'd been working in the Democratic Republic of Congo up in the far northeast region. And it had been nagging at me. I went there for the first time in 2015, and it was now 2020 it was. I was in Ireland, and I thought, maybe I should go back to that story because it was haunting. I was working with a conservation agency. It was really bad security. I'd flown into this region on a missionary plane, and because it was the only way to access it, slightly unnervingly, the missionary organization says a prayer before you take off. And
okay, yes.
Slightly worrying. But I landed in this place where there used to be a training school for elephants. And it was like a kind of lost world of some description, because can you imagine an avenue of kind of broken palms? It looks like almost like it could have belonged to Brussels Boulevard. But in this avenue, there were old stones, big stones, where elephants were tethered and trained, and they were a part of an intention to use the African elephant like the Asian elephant had been used in the British colonies, Burma, Myanmar, India, etc., to work these animals in order to extract the region's vast resources. And that idea reached back to King Leopold of Belgium, who, of course, was the horror who took Congo. So that prompted a story and an investigation, and it took me it's now 2015 and the book's being published.
Because I was flicking through the press notes a couple of days ago, and when I see King Leopold II of Belgium, my blood tends to run cold, because I remember being in Brussels and going to an art gallery in an industrial unit somewhere, and there were photographs of the colony of the Belgian Congo, quote unquote, and you could just tell that awful things had happened. You didn't need a description; you just could tell by the general sort of atmosphere of the photography and of all the colonial nightmares. But the Belgian Congo was perhaps the worst, and that's saying something.
Yeah, I mean, all these things are hard to compare, but I am interested in the. it was like my first book, The Lost Pianos of Siberia. I looked for a piano in Siberia, but what I'm really doing is trying to find a way in for a general reader into really, really important history with untouchable numbers. Stalin's gulags, the Tsarist exile system. And so my search for a piano was a way in as a writer to pull a general reader into that territory, which I think is morally important to understand. I think it is important to on so many levels. And I didn't learn about that in school. I've got two sons. They don't learn about it in school. And Leopold's Congo is the same thing. I mean, there's extraordinary books written on Leopold's Congo, Adam Hochschild's King Leopold's Ghost being the kind of the ultimate book on the history. But will my children pick up that book? I mean, adults. My book is also for kind of adults. You know, it's a hard story. But I saw the elephants as my pianos in this book. It was a mechanism, a narrative mechanism to investigate what happened. 10 million is responsible for 10 million dead. It's an extraordinarily difficult story, but it's not to say there aren't. I had to find a way to engage a reader with what happened. And that's what the book is really all about.
Because if you go in from a starting point saying this is a monster, this is a monstrosity, this is it's just full of terrible things happening, and that sort of imperial colonial rape of Africa that happens, it's just purely for bringing stuff back, then the casual reader the shutters might come down and they don't get involved with it. However, if you start,
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's how do you find a kind of an empathetic connection with the reader? And I mean, it's not to say that I'm confusing metaphors and elephants with people here. I take as much care as I can to ensure the two things are very separate. But there is, there are other levels in here as well. Colonialism, imperialism was genocide in many parts and more. If it can be even said to be more, it's unthinkable. You also have an ecological effects of colonialism and imperialism, and the sheer kind of resource extraction is extraordinary as well. And so, taking the elephant story, which is another very important strand, at the start of the 19th century, you had 26 million elephants in Africa. Okay, now we've got about 400 to 500,000. I've just come back a couple of weeks ago from an assignment in South Sudan, in an area the size of Bangladesh. One elephant that's so lonely it thinks it's a giraffe. So that kind of evisceration of the elephant populations is something I also wanted to look into. And there, in some parts of Africa where the conservation modelling is more secure, you've got very high populations in small areas. But that to me was also interesting because it was the colonialists that came up with the idea of national parks. Complicated idea. There's good in it, and there's complexity in it. So there's all these kind of levels that I'm looking at as I bind history, as I did with my first book, Lost Pianos. I bind history with my own contemporary narrative of traveling through these places, trying to retrieve and talk and understand the impacts among the people that I encounter and the issues they speak of. And the importance of oral memory is a massive, massive part of why I spend so much time on the ground, because I don't believe all history is held between the pages of books in European libraries. I think there is history and memory and spoken memory and how it is spoken through generations. And that's really important to me.
One of the interesting things as well is that with Africa, we as Europeans, and I'm using broad strokes here, but we tend to regard Africa as all one unit. I mean, okay. I mean, obviously, I can look across the Mediterranean Sea and see the Rift Mountains from where I am at the moment. But we tend to think, oh well, Africa is basically a basket case. I have met people who cannot. I've got friends from Sierra Leone, from Freetown, and people don't know where that is. And not only that, but they just think it is literally jungle and whatever. And you talk about, what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and people just think, oh well, that's just Africa, and they're always going to have trouble. And it's always going to be a disaster zone, and they don't know what they're doing, and it's very and that's a very Eurocentric view, Sophie, you have to say, no?
Yeah, I mean, it's a desperate point of view that's got nothing to do with reality. I mean, there are wars that are playing out. There is South Sudan being an example of extraordinary poverty, but there are other narratives too. Dar es Salaam is one of the most vibrant cities I've spent time in. I was among writers, musicians, rap artists, incredibly vibrant youth culture. You right through the country, that contemporary strand really mattered to me because I traveled from Zanzibar, where all the way through to Lake Tanganyika, because when you get into the book, you'll see there's a much earlier attempt made by King Leopold in 1879, and that's the expedition I'm following to start the very first training school for elephants. And he uses 4 Indian Asian elephants in order to train the African elephant. That was the idea. So, and those elephants, they make that journey across that bit of East Africa to the center, to the lake. And so in moving slowly and you're retrieving story and I'm begging beds off people as I'm going through pretty remote territory, et cetera, I'm sleeping in a convent, I'm sleeping in a tent that's this, it's a tent is an exaggeration. It's like a mosquito net that pops up over you. And it's just the width of your body, length of your body. That was how I was traveling. And on trains, cars, however it might turn out in that particular environment I was in. But always I was with contemporary Tanzanians who showed me the absolute opposite of that cliche that Africa is a basket case. Also the absolute opposite of it being one country. Just in Tanzania alone, 120 different ethnic groups that all have really distinct belief systems, traditions, family, the way that family is made up, the way the society groups together. That was really interesting to me. And I needed to spend time, go slow and understand it.
Because you mentioned before, this is fascinating because you talk about, okay, you can't look at it just through European libraries because of the slant that'll have in it. And you mentioned an oral history. So how do you coax an oral history out of somebody to talk about this particular subject? I mean, is it a story that is well known in that region? And it's not, and I'm doing a 2-parter here, so stay with me. It's not just a story about Africa. It's also a story about, Iraq, India, you mentioned in Zanzibar, which is, amazing place. So how, first of all, how easy is it? Because you don't just rock up and say, hi there, tell me about the training school for elephants, because I don't suppose that's the way you do it when you do this research.
No. I mean, it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes rapport. It takes building up trust. I have a really important first principle. If you think about Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, not a single African is given a name. It's pretty extraordinary. I wanted to do the opposite. I name everyone. I don't change names unless somebody specifically asks me to. It's a kind of journalistic, it's a journalistic imperative. So when I am on the ground working with these people, it takes time to get that trust. Do they want to share story? And how do I honor that story? I'm just a conduit. I'm a journalist. I'm a conduit to their stories. And it's amazing. If you do enough work, you find the connections. So it's not a well-known story, this at all. It's a kind of footnote of a footnote of a footnote in an archive. This particular 1879 expedition, but it's amazing when you start looking where you can find the connective tissue. So as an example, in Zanzibar archives are amazing, absolutely amazing, with, letters from everyone from, Henry Morton Stanley to Burton to, and huge collection of Arabic sources as well. And I was looking for the day these elephants arrived in 1879 on the Zanzibar coast. And there was a bishop, an Anglican bishop, who was a bit agitated by the arrival of these elephants because the fanfare that was accompanying them, they'd been shipped in for India, was going to take attention away from what he was doing that very day in June, which was ordaining the first Black East African deacon in the Stone Town in Zanzibar. And I had the name I found the mission diary of that event. I found mention of the elephants. I found mention of that East African deacon and John, he was a gentleman called John Sweddy. And I went to the church about 5 miles away where he was, where he was based. I thought I'd just go and see his grave. I knew he was buried there. When I arrived in this churchyard, there was a gentleman, an older gentleman, washing his clothes among the gravestones. And I got talking to him, and he had this huge brass key. He opened up the church and he started to talk. And he told me that Black East African deacon was, in fact, married to his aunt. He remembered living with him as a child. He remembered sitting with him on his knee. And not only was that profoundly moving to me that history felt that close, but this deacon was also formerly enslaved. So that was how close history sits to the present. Do those elephants matter as the story when you've got this huge, huge human impact? Not really. But what they are is a passport for me to enter that kind of story.
Yeah.
And so we make this connection. And I went back to see his name's Peter. I went back to see him last year to tell him I'd finished the book and I wanted to check my facts. He couldn't do it by email. And he was very proud that memory was put down on paper. And I think those memories should be honored. And I felt very privileged to have found that story and that voice, because it will go.
Because, excuse me, this is the thing. I mean, I'm that worst sort of person. I'm an armchair historian, and people say to me, why are you fascinated by history? Why have you always got your book in something about Al-Andalus or, the Reich or whatever, the Tudors, the plantation that's, Aquitaine. And you've just absolutely, because people think of history as a dusty thing that is, on shelves and you brush it off. But you've absolutely nailed the point, is that actually it's a very thin veil, history, and you literally reach out and touch it, be it via a building, be it via a pathway, a view, or in your case, finding somebody washing their clothes between the gravestones.
Yeah, it's so close. And the point is that, colonialism, former colonialism is over in that part of the world, but its impact, absolutely not. So that connection between past and present, and in fact what is happening looking down the line, is deeply interconnected. I was walking the same footsteps as those Indian elephants walked in 1879. I could intimately compare landscapes. I could intimately compare certain locations, and that I'd uncovered diaries, expedition notes, mission archives, etc., etc. That's what took me so far afield. That's what took me to Scotland, Birmingham, Brussels. It took me to Iraq, where one of the leaders of the expedition had originally been based. And then ultimately it took me back to India, to the town where the 4 elephants and the 13 mahouts were brought from. And that was incredible. I was there on another assignment for a newspaper. I arrived in Mumbai. I thought, you know what, I'm just going to add 4 days on and go to this town, Pune, to see if there's any evidence of those elephants leaving in 1879 for Africa and the 13 mahouts. And I got talking to the taxi driver who I had found on the internet, sort of book at the airport taxi driver guy. And I was knackered. I just wanted to sleep. And he started saying, "Why are you here?" And I thought my story is so weird, a training school for elephants in a place called Lake Tanganyika, that you would shut up and let me sleep. Not a bit of it. He said, that's an extraordinary story. And the little people are never remembered in history. So I'm going to stay with you for the next 4 days and forget about paying me. I did pay him, but he wasn't after my business. He was after honoring the mahouts, who, I'm not going to give the story away, but he was he wanted to honor the mahouts, and he helped me find an incredibly important source who his words finish the book, which is he's a mahout himself in Pune, and he says, an elephant is a very high up place to be cowardly from.
Ooh, that's good. That's because you've got. My question was going to be who brings the elephants over, and I'm presumably it's not because you're looking at African colonialism, and you're looking at obviously it's Indian colonialism as well. So it's
the Brits are all over it. There's King Leopold of Belgium.
Yeah.
He's the one. He commissions the expedition effectively, but he's in cahoots with a Scottish shipping magnate who's building the first road into Africa from Dar es Salaam, into that bit of East Africa from Dar es Salaam. He's in cahoots with the British, who, at that moment in time, the Indian Ocean was being called, an English sea. If you think it's 1879 is an incredible year. I sometimes think I should have just written a book called 1879. You've got the Suez Canal is opened. You've got the first telegraph cable running out to from Africa, East Africa, up to Europe. It's like being re-webbed, steam power. Everything is beginning to happen incredibly fast. So it's like the internet to my generation. That moment in time is 1879 to theirs. And these elephants were shipped over in a steamer. There's quite a funny description of the kind of motley crew who are all on their way to Africa with these four elephants in the hold, sharing their passage with a huge delivery of onions and this stench of elephant and onion coming up from the hold. But it's a story which webs a lot of places together, because that's what it was. It was Europeans making a race on Africa and its resources. 1879. So that's 5 years before you get the official cutting up of the continent, which is the countries the borders we more or less know today. Straight lines cut up like a cake. So that the fact it presages that scramble was also important to me, because it was a way of kind of entering that story from a slightly earlier spot in history.
How do you, when you have something like this, how do you not go off and make this book sort of 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 words? Because it's, because he said it's a web, it's all interneting, there's stuff going on and nothing exists in a vacuum. So you must have had to work really hard to keep it on track, almost like the elephants themselves.
Yeah, it's a really, I think I did probably write about 500,000 words, and then you just kind of chip away, that's the writer's craft, and it's hard. It's really, 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 really hard. And sitting behind me right now in my office in Dorset, there is a map. I call it my serial killer wall. I've been doing them since I first trained to be a journalist, and I kind of put people and maps and pins and newspaper clippings, and it helps me kind of form a pattern and a story. I've always done them, and this one is a particularly complex serial killer wall, because you've got multiple expeditions going on as well, because this one I'm talking about, with these 4 elephants coming in from Dar es Salaam to Lake Tanganyika at that very moment in time, and this is incredibly important, Henry Morton Stanley was under commission from Leopold from a much more secret expedition that was coming in from the other side of Africa, from the Atlantic coast, to go up into what we now know as Congo DRC, in order to start signing deals with chiefs to get the land, which eventually is what becomes the colony. So you've got a lot of things going on all at the same time, and managing that as a writer and keeping some narrative pace and tension it was really complicated. I want to do a really, 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 really simple book next, because
there's a whole thing about, hypocrisy, corruption, abuse. It must be quite difficult to sort of stomach that as well, but also you're a journalist, so you have to keep it impartial and you have to keep it from first person accounts when you can. But there must be some bits that make you go, ye gods, these people were terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do write in the first person. That first person is woven in with the historical. And I write in the first person in with an anxiety, because I'm a white English woman with a posh accent going into Africa, and in a time when, the power balance has to change in who tells whose story. So there's massive anxiety on that topic, of course. But the other side of me thinks you have to confront human cruelty in the eye. You have to confront things that you find difficult. You have to confront what you don't want to know. And in that respect, it's a book that was really important to me, because I've worked in Africa for a long time on other kinds of stories. And I became very uncomfortable with my own ignorance. I became very uncomfortable with the way that Africa is so often seen as one continent, as we touched on earlier in our conversation. But Africa is also so often perceived through the kind of rose-tinted spectacles of the safari land, which is just a fantasy. It's a beautiful fantasy, and I have massively contributed in my travel writing to that fantasy. But it's an out of Africa that exists in the imagination. And on the ground, it's completely different. If you think about those wildlife areas, beautiful, incredible, watching a lion pride, watching elephants move kind of noiselessly across a landscape that's as wide as the eye will ever see. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. There's never any people in those landscapes. And ultimately, people are more interesting than places to me. Ultimately, I want to spend time finding the Peter Sudis. I want to find those oral memories. I want to be among people that tell me what I do not know. And so that's the common ground, if you like, between this book, A Training School for Elephants, and my last, The Lost Pianos of Siberia.
The book is called A Training School for Elephants. It's by Sophy Roberts, who we're speaking to today. You can order it, by the way, via our own virtual bookstore on the TRE website. Sophie, if people want to find you online, I mean, do you have a website? I'm not saying you're TikToking as you go through the Congo, the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, but where can people find you online and say nice things to you?
Oh, well, that's kind. I love using Instagram because it's such a direct means of connecting, and that's at Sophy with a Y _Roberts. And also, for those who are interested in this book, go to my website, which is atrainingschoolforelephants.com, and you'll see some video, you'll see some behind the scenes, you'll see some beautiful photography from a colleague I work with often. Worked also on my Siberia project, Michael Turek. So, there is an abundance of material that you can't fit into an 80,000 word book, especially with all these threads. And that's where it tips over into that website. So I hope you can find some things of interest there.
Only begs the final question. Your serial killer wall, you've mentioned you've done pianos in Siberia, training school for, and you want something simpler. So do you start with a blank canvas, a blank serial killer wall, or is something starting to spiderweb its way across your rather splendid library?
There is something that's beginning. I'm seeing it on the wall just behind the screen. I'm talking to you now, and it's chasing unicorns, which is both a metaphor but also a reality. I think sometimes I chase unicorns. That's where my heart lies. And I'm thinking about a story in Central Asia, which is a place I adore. But yeah, some way off to fixing a path through that mess of clips, which I'm staring at now.
This book is called A Training School for Elephants. It's by Sophy Roberts. Listeners, go and order it via our bookstore. Sophie, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning.
Thank you, Giles, for having me on.